Boldwood presents 21 Nights in Paris, written by Leonie Mack and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Why is he holding his own severed head? Wren grimaced at the chipped stone sculpture propped up on her friend Malou's desk. It wasn't the usual beaux-arts or haute couture found at a fine art auction, but the grisly sculpture was certainly antique. When Malou didn't answer, Wren glanced around the cluttered office, tucked up under the slate roof of the stately stone building. If she pressed her face to the glass of the dormer window, Wren could make out the dreamy, slender pyramid of the Eiffel Tower past the chimneys and rooftops. On the floors below her were the extensive Paris galleries of Asquith Lewis, the renowned auction house and fine art dealer. The tree-lined Avenue des Champs-Élysées paraded by around the corner, the grand axis of an illustrious city. He carried his head from Montmartre to the monastery in Saint-Denis, Malou finally explained, carefully turning the statue and making notes as she examined it. Wren waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. You'd think he'd put it in a bag or something, Wren muttered. But Malou was deep in her work, and Wren was only distracting her. As she was now technically her best friend's employer, she probably shouldn't do that. Anyway, I'm not sure he'd look good on my mantelpiece, she commented. I know, your precious Instagram aesthetic, courtesy of the Asquith Lewis social media experts, but this one comes from the estate of Pierre Leclerc. That alone is enough to sell it. Ah yes, the important work of winning estate auctions which her grandmother excelled at, while joking that it must be because she was close to the grave herself. Not that Wren believed her. Grandmamma was too tenacious to ever fall off her perch. She caught sight of a fragment of stained glass in a wooden frame, propped up on the desk behind the ghastly statue. It showed 3 men with crowns and coloured robes on a vibrant blue background, surrounded by thick, irregular leading. This is perfect for an auction just before Christmas. Is that the Leclerc estate too? He was something of a collector of historic artifacts, it seems, said Malou. Since Game of Thrones was such a hit, this stuff is sure to fit someone's aesthetic. Are you going to have dinner with me tonight? Wren asked. I'm heading home on Sunday. If I have to do without you in London these days, you can at least let me buy you dinner at the Ritz once. Wouldn't it be awkward, though? I think Charlie's still mad at me for quitting. Charlie didn't come with me this trip. Oh? He always comes with you. There's a first time for everything, Wren mumbled around the lump in her throat. Okay, I'll come if I get to return the favour next time, Malou said with a grin. There's this fabulous Ivorian street food cafe around the corner from my apartment. What kind of hygiene certificate does a street food cafe need? You are such a snob, Malou said fondly. I have no idea why you're my friend. Wren mustered a smile. She knew Malou was joking, but friendships were a sore point since she'd been forced to realise how few she truly had. She hated to think how lonely she would feel now if Malou hadn't decided to befriend Wren 5 years ago simply because she liked her. You know very well why you're my friend, Wren said defensively. Because you needed to make appointments to see your fiancé, and I used to organise his diary, Malou laughed. I was worried when I got this job and moved back to Paris that his new assistant would replace me. No one will ever replace you, Wren said earnestly. These days, she was dealing with Charlie's new assistant, so she didn't have to see the man himself. If I wasn't so happy for you that you got this job, I would be annoyed that you left me. I left Charlie, never you. Leaving Charlie might turn out to be another thing they had in common, Wren thought bitterly. But okay, let's go for dinner. Anywhere but the Ritz, Malou insisted. What's wrong with the Ritz? You never leave the Ritz. I'm not suggesting you suddenly get your hair braided or a tattoo, but there are 19 other arrondissements of Paris you've never visited, or 18 since you obviously come here to the 8th occasionally. I've been to the 7th too. Ah, of course. To visit the Tour Eiffel, I assume. No, the Musée d'Orsay. I've never been up the Eiffel Tower. Wren glanced at the window and stifled a sigh. I should leave you to it. Text me when you're done for the day and meet me at the Ritz. I said not the Ritz. Just meet me there. You're hoping to lure me into l'Espadon, Malou accused, not without grounds. L'Espadon was Wren's favourite of the restaurants at the Ritz. Just think, scallops or pork medallions in jus or lobster salad. And I'm thinking you're afraid of change, Malou replied. Her friend had no idea. Wren's phone buzzed and she fetched it out of her pristine white leather handbag. When she saw the short message, her breath deserted her, her throat seized up. No, not now, not like this. She hadn't finished preparing the company, her grandmother, the world for this. Oh, God, she'd held it all together for nothing. Shit. Are you okay? She fumbled to shut down her screen before Malou saw. Not that it mattered. Those 4 words in the text message meant even Malou would find out, probably before the day was out. Shit! Just before Christmas, before year-end, the investors would have a meltdown after everything her grandmother had done to build up the business. As if on cue, her phone rang, Grandmama's face flashing up on the screen. She quickly silenced the call. Sorry, I've been lying to you for 6 months while I tried to work out how to save our image after Charlie dumped me didn't feel like something she could blurt out over the phone. Wren, seriously, you're scaring me. You look white as a sheet. I have to go. Now. Go? Back to London. I'm sorry about dinner. Is your family all right? Charlie? Yes, everyone's okay. At least, until her grandmother had a heart attack at the news. She twisted the Marquise cut diamond ring on her finger in agitation. She'd been wearing the 4 carats of vintage Cartier on her left hand for over a year, but now it felt like it was burning. Wren wanted to flee back to the Ritz, dive under the embroidered silk duvet, and forget who she was. Unfortunately, the world would always remind her that she was Irena Asquith Lewis, and by the end of the day, she knew her name would be splashed all over the news. Without stopping to kiss Malou on the cheek, she stumbled out of her friend's office and clutched the banister of the grand marble staircase as she made her way through the galleries to street level. She dismissed the photographer and the social media assistant who were waiting for her in the lobby. She had to get back to London and formulate a new plan, even if it meant talking to Charlie. Wren burst out of the double doors and fumbled for her phone to call her Paris driver. The message was still there. Everyone knows. I'm sorry. She swiped it away and made the phone call. Bilal was much too diplomatic to comment on the fact that Wren was quietly hyperventilating in his Mercedes. He took her to the Ritz and waited while she threw her things into a suitcase and hastily settled her bill. Less than half an hour later, her assistants had sent a ticket to her phone and she was on her way to the Gare du Nord for a 5 o'clock train. She might have been nervous about travelling alone in the gathering dusk, but she was too worried about Grandmama and about how they would fix this mess to care. She'd had 6 months to find a solution of her own and had failed. The boulevards of Paris were a blur as she stared out of the window without seeing. It felt as if everything had fallen apart at once. 6 months she'd held on to her sanity, her despair, keeping the secret, and now it was all for nothing. Charlie Routledge didn't want to marry her. What that meant for the proposed merger of their family businesses, the eminently sensible union of a real estate empire and a centuries-old auction house, was unclear, but Wren was sure it wouldn't be good. And what it meant for Wren herself? She was an heiress and a socialite, the personification of the Asquith Lewis brand that traded on exclusivity and mixing in elite social circles. But she was also 30 and now single, with a lifestyle that made it almost impossible to meet people. Charlie had been perfect. He was an old family friend, good-natured and attractive, and they had a lot in common, she'd thought. He'd shared Wren's commitment to her aspirational social media feeds and the expectations of the family business. Apparently, that just hadn't been enough for him. The black car slowed in traffic, and Wren roused herself to some kind of attention. The red lights of the car in front were out of focus. The windscreen wipers were on full. The boulevard shone in the dim light of the waning December afternoon as the car rolled to a slow stop. "I'm so sorry, Mademoiselle Wren," Bilal said. They inched along the road another few feet. Wren peered out of the window and checked the map on her phone. "I'll just get out here. The station's not far." "But it's raining," Bilal protested. "The weather might suit my mood." "It'll be all right," she said faintly, thinking of more than just the rain. She glanced at the sky, willing the light to hold out. If darkness fell before she got to her train, she'd have a whole host of new problems. "What about your suitcase?" Wren pictured the buckled, monogrammed monstrosity in the boot of the car with another dart of panic. "I'll manage," she murmured. "I'll have to. Thank you again for all your help, Bilal." She felt unexpectedly sad to be leaving Paris. Her phone was still buzzing non-stop in her pocket, but at least in Paris nobody took a moment's notice of the heiress who had been dumped and struggled to get herself to the train station on her own. "Let me park by the trottoir." Bilal swerved, and the front wheel jumped the curb as he attempted to drop her off more safely. Her mind a jumble, she shoved open the door and snatched her hand back with a shriek. She heard a piercing cry of "Putain!" and then a metallic crunch. Wren cowered on the seat with her hands over her head as the window shattered. There was a heavy thud and a long groan. With the bang of Bilal's door and shouts of alarm in Arabic, the world came suddenly back into focus. So much for "it'll be all right." A cyclist lay prone on the tarmac, his feet tangled in his ruined bicycle, and he wasn't moving. Wren sprang into action despite her pounding heart, and when Bilal tried to hold her back, she wouldn't let him. She heard a clatter that sounded like her phone as she rushed to tend to her victim, but she ignored it. Kneeling beside him and positioning his arm carefully, she grasped his leather jacket at the shoulder and the waist and managed to haul him into the recovery position. Her fingers groped for the snap of his helmet, and she supported his head while she unwound her cashmere scarf and settled it underneath as a pillow. She took deep, even breaths to keep the panic at bay as she searched for injuries. The man's hair was black and curly and tumbled over his face. He had an inch of unkempt beard. She ran her hands over his head, searching for any indication of injury, and she spied a line of cursive script that was tattooed on his neck. Wren couldn't help worrying it might be needed to identify his body, but she couldn't see any blood. She cursed, realizing she should have checked his airway first. She dropped her ear to his mouth, and to her relief, his breath tickled her ear. Before she could draw away and check the rest of his body, he opened his eyes, wide open, and stared at her. He had fine, dark eyes, framed with thick lashes. He drew in a deep breath, and she felt him exhale on her cheek. His eyes were too dark for her to check the pupils for signs of concussion, but she tried anyway. He was breathing evenly. She drew back a little, not quite trusting the good signs enough to remove her hand from his head or tear her gaze from him. His face was oval with high cheekbones, and his brow was thick and lopsided. His was an undeniably interesting face. As the rain flowed in freezing droplets down the back of her neck and turned her hair into a frizzy orange mess and her cardigan to a sodden lump of cashmere, she held his cheek and stared into his eyes until she could barely believe he was a stranger. Suddenly the man frowned with a deep twist of his brow and looked away, glancing at his legs and shifting experimentally. "Careful," she said softly, hoping he understood English. "You might be hurt." He met her gaze again and raised a hand in front of her face, tugging up his sleeve and presenting his wrist. A pattern of tattoos in bold geometric lines peeked out of the cuff. "Do I have a pulse?" he asked. He mispronounced the U, and Wren was so distracted by his earnest frown that she didn't realize he'd made a joke until it was too late, and she was already reaching for his hand. She took his wrist hesitantly, pressing on the warm skin. His pulse fluttered under her fingertips. "I think you'll live," she murmured, breaking eye contact. "This was entirely my fault. I shouldn't have tried to get out of the car onto the bike path, especially without looking. Whatever you need, I'll pay." "C'est bon, ça va. He's fine, I'm fine." He pushed himself up with a grunt. "Stay still. Bilal, call an ambulance." "Vraiment, really? Can I check my vélo? My bicycle?" Wren glanced at the mess of his bike, lying twisted and pathetic on the curb. Behind it was a single-wheeled trailer which had tipped over and spilled a few boxes onto the bus lane. Not only had she possibly injured the poor man, but it looked as if she'd taken away his livelihood too, at least until he could repair his bike. She grasped his arm and carefully helped him to his feet. "Don't worry about anything. I will compensate you if this means you can't work until the bike is fixed. We'll take you to the hospital and let me know how much it is and I can... Here, take the money I have on me." Wren dived to the footwell for her handbag and produced a wad of euro notes. The man took a long look at the cash, but didn't accept it, even when she shook it at him in agitation. He stooped to gather up her scarf and handed it to her. Why wasn't he taking the money? Was he planning to sue? It was certainly his right. "Let me take care of this," she pleaded. "I can pay my driver to deliver the rest of these packages for you today, if your employer—" He gave an unexpected laugh, short and sharp. "I'm not a courier." He ran a hand through his unruly hair. The way he said courier danced off his tongue, and Wren noticed that his accent was much stronger than those of the employees at Asquith Lewis. She spent several heartbeats marvelling at how lovely it was to listen to him talk, before his words sank in, along with her confusion. "Oh, what?" Chapter 2. Sacha stepped gingerly forward, testing his legs. There didn't seem to be any broken bones. His shoulder throbbed, but even that pain was subsiding now. He inspected the wreck of his bike with an enormous sigh, propping his hands on his hips. The stranger, the woman with the warm hands and expensive shoes, followed him, but he threw out his good arm to stop her. The area was littered with glass shards, not many because of the high-quality safety glass, but enough for him to realize his helmet had saved him a serious injury. He glanced back to see her still clutching the bundle of notes. "Put the money away," he said through his teeth, trying not to laugh at the ridiculousness of the situation. One moment he'd been pedaling furiously along the Boulevard de Magenta, and the next he'd bounced off his own handlebars and was heading for the concrete after smashing the woman's window with his head. If that wasn't surreal enough, he'd then opened his eyes to find this woman, blurred and soft around the edges, filling his vision. Her voice, speaking the plum sort of English that was easy to understand, had soothed his adrenaline-induced shock. With the weak sun behind her, and his thoughts scattered, he'd had to ask himself if he was imagining her. His mind was clear now, but she still looked dreamlike, with her red hair, the kind that wasn't really red but bright orange, her pale face and subdued features, not to mention her stiff posture and tailored clothing. Then there were her eyes, brown eyes, the colour of caramel syrup, bright and clear. Stay back, Mademoiselle Reine, the driver called, hurrying over. Had the man said reine? A queen? Sacha was quite confused, which he sincerely hoped wasn't because of the knock to his head. But that was enough daydreaming. He had somewhere to be and no way to get there. Now his bike had been reduced to twisted metal. Sacha turned to the driver. Pourriez-vous m'aider? He asked, gesturing to the boxes that were blocking the cycle path and spilling into the bus lane. Je m'en occupe, the driver assured him he would take care of it and reached for a package. But instead of piling them up on the footpath, as Sacha had intended, he opened the luggage compartment of the car and dropped the first ones in. Non, 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 Sacha cried, grasping his shoulder when the pain shot down his arm again. You're hurt. With a gentle grip on his arm, the woman turned him back to her. We need to get this treated. Let Bilal drive you wherever you need to go, after we've taken you to the hospital. I can call a friend, he insisted. You don't need to worry. He needed to get in touch with Joseph anyway, even though his friend would likely fuss just as much as this stranger. You can't tell me not to worry when I've just caused an accident. Come and sit in the car. She tugged on his good arm. I can take him to the hospital, mademoiselle, the driver spoke up. You might still catch your train. No, I'm not leaving until I know he's going to be okay. Her words brought a tingle to the back of Sacha's neck, but he ignored it. It was probably nerve damage from the wrench to his shoulder. I will take him, the driver insisted. What would your grandmother say? Go catch your train, Sacha urged. I'll let your driver take me to hospital. Je vous promets. Those eyes. The way she looked at him with her heart in her eyes prompted so many questions he'd never know the answer to. Je vous en prie. Allez-y. I am coming to the hospital with you. The driver, Bilal, clucked his tongue, but he didn't protest anymore. He simply snagged another box. Before he got to the car, the sodden flaps underneath gave way, sending the contents onto the road with a clang. Sacha lurched to catch what he could, narrowly avoiding a collision with the woman as she did the same. She retrieved a silver snuff box and a bronze coffee pot, inspecting the objects with interest and glancing doubtfully at him. He ignored her look and plucked the items out of her grip, not daring to check for damage. It was none of her business why he was transporting small antiques. She'd already misjudged him once. Another time wouldn't make any difference. Sacha picked up another box himself, willing away the pain in his shoulder. He didn't have time for it, not with Joseph's Christmas nonsense next weekend, on top of the usual pressures of life and work. He got as far as the tail light of the Mercedes before Bilal took the box from him. The luggage compartment was full, with his boxes and a large patterned suitcase that matched the woman's expensive shoes and even more expensive manners. Next, Sacha fetched his bike, grimacing at the damage as he hauled it off the cycle path. The trailer was a piece of shit he never bothered to lock, and no one bothered to steal. He chained up the bike with a fleeting worry that it would be taken away as rubbish. But this was Paris, after all, and the council would never be so efficient. He'd need a new front wheel, but he could probably repair the rest himself. The damage to her car door was more serious. Bilal produced a brush and cleared the shards of glass from the back seat of the car, right where the woman must have been sitting. Sacha frowned and turned to her. Et vous alors, ça va? Are you all right, madame? Reine, she corrected him quickly. Irena, really, but call me Reine, not madame. So, not Reine, after all. But I'm fine. As though only now realizing his meaning, she glanced at her hands and patted her damp head. A fragment of glass was trapped in her hair, winking in the light of the street lamp. Here, he said, gently retrieving the shard. It wasn't sharp, but it snagged in her hair, making her chignon even more of a mess. She smiled at him in thanks. "And you are?" staring at the pretty woman like a tongue-tied imbecile. He looked away quickly, clearing his throat. "Sacha," he said curtly. He noticed something on the road near the front wheel and bent to retrieve it, grimacing when he saw it was a phone. The screen was smashed, and there was a large crack in the casing. He held it out. "Yours?" She grabbed for it. "Crap," she muttered when it wouldn't turn on. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's just been a bad day." "You must sit in the front, mademoiselle. I will tape the window for now. The hospital is not far," Bilal interrupted. "If Sacha is injured, he should take the front seat," she insisted. Bilal clucked his disapproval once more, but didn't argue. He merely gave Sacha a long look and ushered Wren protectively around the car to the other side. The driver's wariness made Sacha try one more time. "Why don't we go to the Gare du Nord first and then to the hospital? The station is not far." "What if you have a head injury? The symptoms don't always appear right away. I can take a later train, but I won't forgive myself if—" She gestured helplessly, and Sacha nodded with a sigh. So much for a busy evening in Joseph's workshop. The hospital was the usual mix of endless corridors and confusing signage, even more overwhelming in French, but Wren had a surprisingly clear head. There was nothing she could do to stop the fallout from her suddenly public breakup with Charlie, but she could make up for her stupidity in injuring a stranger. A stranger called Sacha. If she'd thought the name Sacha was feminine before, she never would again. It was difficult not to notice his broad shoulders and tough body language. He was wiry rather than muscular, and not particularly tall. There was a competence about his movements, an efficiency and lack of elegance that appealed to her, and her eyes continually strayed to the tattoo on his neck. "Do you have a headache?" she asked as they took their seats in the waiting area. "No," he replied. She helped him tug his jacket gingerly over his shoulder. His rough woolen pullover was thankfully dry, unlike her cardigan, lying in a sodden heap in the back of the car. She'd shrugged into another one before rushing into the hospital, but her hair was still damp. Perhaps she should have taken the time to find her coat. "I think you were unconscious for a few minutes, but I didn't watch the time," she said. "It will be okay." She glanced up, realizing she'd been clasping her hands into tight fists, and he spoke with a gentle tone as though she was the patient. "My bad day seems to have spread to you." "Un malheur n'arrive jamais seul," he said softly. Wren repeated the words back under her breath, trying to translate what he'd said. "A bad luck doesn't never arrive alone," he supplied. His poor translation, combined with the utter earnestness of his expression, made her smile. She wanted to write it down to remember it later, but that would seem strange. "When it rains, it pours," we say in English. "Ah, we say that too. A more appropriate saying for the weather today." He fell silent again, and they both stared blindly at the public health posters about hand hygiene and alcohol consumption. "You are going to London?" he asked. She nodded, trying not to think of everything she had to face when she got home. "I was only in Paris for a few days on business." She hoped he wouldn't ask what business. It would be difficult to explain that visiting the boutiques on the Place Vendôme was part of her job. "I'm sorry Paris could not solve your problems." She laughed bitterly. "I didn't realize Paris was a therapist." "A therapist, a poet, an artist, and a clown. That's Paris. Which do you need?" "All of them," she said. "Most of all, I need a miracle worker." "Ah well, perhaps you are in the right place after all," he said lightly. "You've heard of the Cour des Miracles? Les Misérables? Or The Hunchback of Notre Dame? The Gypsy Hideout. I only know the Disney version. He couldn't quite conceal his grimace. It's not quite the intention of Victor Hugo's tragedy. He pronounced it Victor Hugo, which Wren found utterly charming. No? Well, I don't like tragedies, so I apologise to your friend Monsieur Hugo if I give his book a miss. You don't appreciate the romance of the hunchback dying out of love? Is that what happens? She shuddered. How awful! But he is the best of men, Quasimodo. Good for him, she muttered. It doesn't sound very romantic. Although what did she know about romance? The warm, thick hospital air suddenly choked her. What was Charlie doing right now? Celebrating that he could now go out in public with his new love? The bloody ring felt wrong on her finger. The elongated diamond only reminded her that it had been impossible to find a wedding band to match. She should have taken that as a warning. On a sudden impulse, she gave the ring a tug to remove it. She didn't need to pretend anymore. She was officially unengaged. She should at least get some satisfaction out of that fact. The ring was tight over her knuckle, but she just pulled harder. Ow! She groaned. Reine. Her name sounded strange in his strong accent that pronounced the R far back in the throat. Reine. A pair of rough hands closed over hers. She looked up. Sacha's face was close, the deep furrowed brow and his big soulful eyes, and his lips were pursed, which made her realize she was staring at his mouth. He gently loosened her fingers. With Charlie's ring stuck on her knuckle, her phone dead, the world ready to celebrate her scandal with schadenfreude, and the moment lit by harsh white hospital lights, Wren stared at Sacha and wondered what it would be like to kiss him. Chapter 3. Sacha Mourad? Sacha snatched his hands back from Wren's, leaving the ring still stuck on her knuckle. She tried to shove it back into place, but it wouldn't budge in either direction. The voice summoned him again, and heat rose to her cheeks. She inwardly shook herself. Tattoos and work boots were a strange fetish to be suddenly developing. Pull yourself together, Wren. Only when they were halfway down the corridor did she realise she probably should have left him alone to see the doctor, but she found herself in the consultation room, standing in the corner, clutching his jacket as he and the nurse held a conversation in rapid French. Before Wren could decide whether to sit or stand, Sacha had hopped up onto the examination table and was stripping off his shirt, and it was somehow too late to tear her eyes off him. He had a full sleeve of tattoos with another, 2 crossed swords, on his left biceps. The hospital lighting showed up all the grooves of lean muscle. She couldn't help thinking that Charlie, for all his hours in the gym and bulking diet, didn't have definition like that. Sacha exchanged more words with the nurse, a tight smile sometimes touching his lips. His front teeth were a little crooked. Not much, but in Wren's circle they would have been corrected. She quite liked them. The nurse checked his eyes and performed a series of tests for balance, and, Wren guessed, memory and concentration. While Wren stood in the corner, trying not to watch Sacha, and definitely not to appreciate his expressive looks and incomprehensible words, the next Eurostar from the Gare du Nord pulled out of the station. Sacha lifted his gaze and caught Wren staring. She took an instinctive step back, hitting the wall. What kind of idiot checked out the man she'd just knocked down? An hour later, Sacha had been cleared of a concussion, and they wandered out of the double doors of the emergency department, his arm in a sling. Night had fallen, and the rain had turned to misty drizzle that gathered around the street lamps in hazy brightness. Wren shivered at the sudden change in temperature and the encroaching darkness. A moment later, Sacha's fleece-lined coat landed on her shoulders, and she grasped the collar reflexively. "Shouldn't you stay?" He shook his head to cut her off. Your hair is still wet. I'm sure Bilal isn't far, she said, shrugging into the jacket. Ow, she muttered, realizing how much her finger ached from the ring wedged onto her knuckle. Let me see, Sacha said, taking her hand. Aye, your finger is purple. It's not. Sacha held her hand up to the light, and Wren grimaced when she saw the mottling on her fingertip. She tugged once more ineffectually at the blasted thing, her breath hitching. Wren took a slow breath in and out. You know what else we say in English about bad luck? It comes in threes. Also in French. Jamais deux sans trois. Never two without three. As long as we do without four, I can keep it together, she muttered for her own benefit. Do you have cream for the hands? In the car, she said. Where is Bilal? Perhaps he called? She muttered another curse, remembering her dead phone, but on the other hand, she reflected ruefully, no one could call her if her phone was dead. No notifications, no urgent demands that she turn up and face the scandal. Wren tried the smashed device one more time, but it definitely wouldn't turn on. With a sudden laugh that was probably bordering on hysterical, she tossed it into a nearby bin, feeling liberated. Until, that is, she realized she was out at night with no phone, alone without Charlie or an assistant. Had it suddenly got darker? Do you have Bilal's number? I could call him. She glanced at her companion. The warmth of his coat around her shoulders attested to the fact that she wasn't quite alone. After another rummage in her bag, she handed Sacha a business card with Bilal's number on it. There followed a quick conversation in French, where all she caught was "En fait?" and "Jusque-là," although she couldn't remember what they meant anyway. After he ended the call, Sacha explained. Bilal has had trouble changing the car for a new one, and he'll be at least half an hour. He is profoundly sorry. Wren glanced around and then wished she hadn't. She was somewhere deep in the 10th arrondissement. There was a Turkish snack bar across the road and a handful of shops with their shutters down. A concrete wall ran around the hospital, covered in posters and graffiti. So much for the City of Light. Outside Wren's beloved 1st arrondissement, it was a city of dark corners. She shuddered, taking a deep breath. I'm sorry you're not at home resting, she said, although it wasn't quite true. If it weren't for those mysterious boxes of antiques held hostage in Bilal's car, he would have left her all alone with her irrational fears. He shook his head, sending little points of light off his curls from the drizzle. I have an idea, he said abruptly, to fix both of your problems. He thought she only had 2 problems. On y va. Gesturing for her to follow, he took off into the dark evening in the depths of a Paris she didn't know. She should be wary of following, but being in Paris with a handsome stranger was 100 times better than facing Grandmamma's wrath in London. On y va, she thought to herself. Let's go. Sacha phoned Joseph as they walked, glossing over the reasons for his delay. He couldn't explain to the old man that he'd been to the hospital, but he was fine and he was now taking a strange woman to a bar, but not for the usual reasons, although he couldn't remember the last time he'd taken a woman to a bar for any reason. Within 10 minutes, they had made it to the 20th arrondissement and paused at a crossing. The intersection wasn't anything special. Sacha didn't even need to look anymore to picture the graffitied shutters of the Chinese supermarket, covered in profanities in 6 languages. The building had been repurposed from a theatre, and the chunky lettering still remained, the concrete awning in need of a clean. It was a typical Parisian crossroad, with cobbled streets, a mix of golden stone buildings from the 19th century, contemporary apartment blocks, and everything in between. Scooters and bikes and rushing pedestrians swept past them, and shivering smokers sat at tables outside the cafe across the street, still busy at this time of night. It was Belleville, home, but Wren stared as though he'd taken her to Disneyland. "Welcome to Paris," he said dryly. "This is not the Paris I know," she replied. "It's not quite the Court of Miracles. The slums were demolished 150 years ago. But perhaps we will find here what you need to solve at least one of your problems." She followed him with a wide-eyed smile. He had noticed she smiled a lot. As he paused across the street from their destination, she took it all in as though this was her first trip to the Louvre, not a bar. He kept hold of her hand when she nearly tripped on the uneven curb. "This place is interesting," she said, peering down the neighbouring alley where the patrons of the bar spilled out, huddled under heaters. "First time in Paris?" "No, I visit all the time. I just don't know it well, apparently." Once inside, Wren stared at the red neon lettering above the bar, the bottles of spirits in rows, and the clusters of young patrons. A tourne-disque in the corner played a mixture of cabaret, chansons, and rhythmic Congolese soukous. A couple of white women with dreadlocks and lip piercings grooved in the middle of the room after setting their drinks on a decoupaged table. Wren would have looked out of place, except her thoroughly dishevelled state disguised her chic outfit. She was pale, and her makeup had worn off. Freckles had come out on her cheeks like stars. No one would even notice her tailored trousers, black and white designer boots, and the earrings that matched her ring. Well, perhaps someone would notice the earrings. The diamonds were enormous. "Une margarita glacée et un thé à la menthe," he ordered when the barman approached. "Oh," she said, and reached into her bag. "Do we pay now or later?" She placed a €100 note hurriedly onto the bar. Sacha slapped his hand over it and swiped it back in her direction. "Don't you have anything smaller?" "Why? Are there pickpockets around?" "I've only seen a handful of €100 notes in my life. You don't need to be extravagant. Most places in Paris do take credit card these days." "I'm not being extravagant," she mumbled. "Surely there won't be too much change from 100. He was speechless for long enough that the barman returned with their drinks and casually took the note, holding it up to the light to check it was genuine. Wren sniffed at the slight before glancing down at her rumpled clothing with a sigh of dismay. "Thank you for the drink," he muttered, clearing his throat. She didn't reply, but turned her perplexed gaze to her glass. "Is that a frozen margarita?" "It's for your finger." "My what?" He picked up her hand and lifted it above her head. She stared at him, her mouth ajar. "We elevate the hand and then you hold your finger on the glass. The cold makes your finger contract and we take the ring off." Oh, she stammered. "Good. I don't want to damage it. The ring, I mean, not my finger." "Your finger also. The ring is important to you?" Her eyes clouded, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to know or not, but his hand curled around hers instinctively. "No," she said, "it's not important at all. Perhaps it never was. Perhaps I never was, to him." He was close enough to notice her lip trembling. He opened his mouth to say something, he had no idea what, but she spoke instead. "But it is vintage Cartier." He released a slow breath. She was from a different world, after all. "Cartier makes it important?" "Of course." She glanced up at their joined hands, her elevated hand. "Have we held it enough yet? My arm is going numb." And her face was too close. He cleared his throat. "I hope it's not the gangrène." "It's not gangrene. That's a bad joke." "Sorry. I have the habitude." "The habit," she corrected gently. "It starts with an H." "So does habitude, but I am French. We don't breathe on each other when we talk." She spluttered for long enough that he almost felt bad for teasing her. "Well, you gargle my name like mouthwash."
Reine,
he repeated, stifling another unexpected smile.
It does not sound like mouthwash.
He repeated her name a few times.
It sounds like reine, the French word for queen.
Queen?
It suits you, no?
No, she said, her tone defensive. Now, can I lower my hand? He nodded, letting her hand go and nudging the glass in her direction. He picked up his own tea, left-handed because of the sling, and took a sip. Wren closed her fingers around her tumbler and held it there, wincing at the cold.
Why, Reine? Why don't people call you Irena?
She leaned heavily on the bar, as though she'd already had a few margaritas. Seeing the look on her face, he wished he hadn't asked what he'd thought was a simple question. My mother was Russian, hence the name.
I'm sorry.
That she was Russian?
No, that she was.
Oh, she said, her voice trailing off. I don't remember much about her. My grandmother disapproved of her humble origins and refuses to call me Irena to this day. Since my parents died when I was a child, there isn't anyone else to call me anything except Wren, she explained with false brightness.
What does it mean, do you know?
That seemed safer than all of the other follow-up questions that sprang into his mind. My name? I have no idea.
You never looked up the meaning?
She shook her head.
Here, let's look.
He pulled out his phone. You're not into some weird astrology with names, are you?
Astrology is about stars.
You know what I mean.
If you mean do I think there is destiny in a name, then no. But
she was staring at him with an unexpected focus that made heat rush to his cheeks.
But words have meaning and power in their own way.
So, what does my name mean then? She asked with sudden eagerness. He unlocked his phone as quickly as he could and opened a browser to search.
It means peace. It comes from the ancient Greek goddess of peace.
I suppose that figures. I hate conflict.
And tragedies.
Exactly. He leaned on the bar and studied her. He'd met her at a low point, it appeared, but her low point was full of grace. He'd rarely reached for that word, la grâce. It sounded old-fashioned and almost reverent. He was probably just awed by her $1,000,000 manners. What does your name mean, then? The tables turned. It felt strangely personal to share the meaning of his own name, a name his parents had chosen with care. But she'd answered him.
As a masculine name, it derives from Alexander, which means defender of people. It is also a feminine name of Arabic origin. In that case, it means helper or supporter.
That's a lot to live up to, she said softly. He met her curious gaze and immediately wished he hadn't. He didn't need to set his heart pounding because a wealthy stranger looked at him like that. She released a slow breath through pursed lips. Then she lifted her glass and took a sip of her margarita. A big sip. Ooh, she said, cocking her head to inspect the cocktail.
Here,
he said, spreading salt around the edge of her glass from a little bowl the barman had placed next to them.
And take a pincée and throw it over your shoulder.
Does that make it taste better?
No, it sends away the bad luck.
This margarita and I were meant to meet tonight, she said with a smile. She reached for a pinch of salt and began to toss it over her shoulder, but he lurched to stop her, grasping her wrist.
Not that shoulder. The left.
She grimaced. I already let it go. He groaned. Does that mean more bad luck? What do I do about that?
I think the best thing you can do is drink the margarita.
She laughed more heartily than the poor joke deserved, and he laughed too, slightly bewildered and reluctantly charmed.
"You've never had a margarita before?" he asked.
"No," she admitted. She took another long sip. It's good with the salt. I'll have to see if they have these in the bar at the Ritz."
"I'm sure they do,"
he said. The Ritz. It figured.
"Why haven't you ever drunk a margarita?"
"Oh, there are so many things you'd think I would have done, and I haven't." She propped her chin on her other hand and looked around the bar again. "I've never been to a bar like this."
"I've never been to the Ritz."
"Oh, you must. There's nowhere quite like the Ritz."
"I believe you,"
he said dryly. "Ha!" she responded. "Do you live around here then? Not that you need to give me an address. I'm just making small talk. I'm not going to follow you home and steal your things." He didn't need the reminder that they were strangers who didn't know each other's surnames.
"I'm more worried about you following me home and posting cash into my letterbox. Yes, I live some streets away. The quartier is called Belleville."
"You have a quartier, and I have Cartier," she said with a chuckle. "Were you going home from work when I hit you?"
"No, I was going the other way. My friend restores antiques. I was going to his stockroom in Saint-Ouen."
"Oh, okay."
"You won't report me to the police?"
She froze and opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her eyes were huge and alarmed.
"It was a joke," he said with a frown.
"Oh," she said. "Your habitude strikes again." He inclined his head, staring into his tea. "If you smile when you joke, I won't be so confused. So why were you transporting stolen goods to wherever it was?"
"They're not—"
I know. My turn to joke."
"Oh, I am helping to prepare for a grotte du Père Noël, you know?"
"Père Noël? You're playing Father Christmas?"
"No, my friend is the Père Noël."
"You're one of his elves?"
"Elves? Yes, you could say that."
"You don't look like an elf."
"No? I look like a bicycle courier who steals antiques, no?"
Her tongue-tied apology tempted him into a smile, but she still didn't pick up that he was joking.
"Don't worry. You look like the Queen of England to me."
"I hope I don't look 90 years old," she said, glancing at her rumpled outfit. "I look quite unkempt."
"My fault. Thank you for ruining your clothes for me. Those pantalons are probably by Louis Versace."
"Louis Vers... Oh, you're joking again. Actually, they're Givenchy. But you're lucky your head is worth more to me because these are ruined." He imagined his definition of ruined differed from hers.
"I am lucky tonight," he agreed lightly. "Shall we try to take the ring off? You don't have much ice left."
"Oh, it must have stopped hurting," she said, squinting at her finger. "Right. Here goes," she said. Chapter 4. She pulled hard, too hard as it turned out. The ring slipped off easily, but she lost her grip and it went sailing through the air. The music stopped at that moment, as though every pair of eyes in the bar were on the glinting white gold band with the enormous diamond. Wren watched with wry detachment. There went the 5 years of her life she'd spent with Charlie, hurtling towards the sticky floor of a dodgy bar. With an audible tinkle, the ring landed somewhere near a curved velvet sofa the colour of vomit. Sacha leapt to his feet and went after it. Despite the sling, he dropped to his knees and started searching one-handed. Wren knew she should join him. She should feel something. Charlie had known she loved Cartier from the Art Deco period. He'd hunted down the perfect ring and commissioned a matching set of earrings. No one knew her better than Charlie. But Charlie wouldn't recognize her now, sitting in a bar in a graffitied corner of Paris, in the company of a tattooed Christmas elf, staring after her precious ring, as though it wouldn't matter if she lost it forever. Strangest of all, she liked the idea of surprising Charlie, surprising everyone. Now the worst had actually happened. A host of possibilities unfolded in her imagination, all of them preferable to pretending that she was still with Charlie. Despite the bad luck and the accident, this had been the best evening she'd had for a long time. In the morning she'd be Irena Asquith Lewis again, and decide how best to mitigate the damage she'd caused to her family's legacy. But not now. She lifted the melting cocktail and tossed the rest of it back in one gulp. The salt and the citrus made her grimace, or perhaps that was the tequila. When she stood to help Sacha, she had a pleasant buzz to go with her dizzying uncertainty. He was peering under the ugly sofa, near the ugly lamp. The view of him searching on the floor improved the ugly sofa somewhat. She shouldn't ogle her victim, but she'd had such a shitty day that she couldn't stop herself. He fumbled under the sofa with his left arm, but his injured shoulder gave out, and he crumpled face first onto the polished concrete floor. She rushed over as he hauled himself back up, hitting his head on a bar stool with a yelp. She dropped to her knees and grasped his thick pullover at the shoulders. "Are you okay?" He smiled faintly at her, his brow bunched over his soft eyes. A sweetheart. That's what he was.
"I didn't find it yet, but thanks for saving me. Again."
"I only seem to save you after making you fall."
"Getting up again is more important than how many times you fall."
Wren stilled, staring into his eyes. She had the impression he spoke from experience, but she'd never know, and she was surprised how sad she felt when she realized that. "I think my family's motto is, don't ever fall, or maybe don't let anyone see you fall."
"Is that why you've never had a margarita?"
"Exactly."
"Are we going to find this ring?"
"I don't know." She smiled ruefully. "But I suppose I have to look." He gave her a curious glance. They searched the back of the sofa, along the skirting board, in the rug, and even in the filth under the bar, but the blasted thing was nowhere to be found. Sacha sighed and propped one hand on his hip.
"I didn't think a diamond that size would be so easy to miss."
"Are you suggesting my engagement ring was showy?" His gaze snapped up to hers.
Oh...
"Don't worry, I won't take it personally, coming from you."
Thank you."
His look was full of curiosity.
"Your engagement ring,"
he repeated. "Yes," she said flatly. "I suppose I should give it back, if we can find it."
"We'll find it."
He sounded as though he'd search until sunrise and come back tomorrow with a metal detector if she let him. They returned wordlessly to the hunt. When the patrons standing nearby heard they were looking for an engagement ring, they crouched down to help, as did the two girls with dreads and piercings, and a few minutes later, the barman, after handing Wren a tequila shot on the house that made her gag and then sneeze. Half an hour later, Wren felt guilty and told everyone to stop looking. She'd also realized the time, mainly because her stomach was rumbling. It was dinner time in Paris, 9:30 p.m., and the last Eurostar had just pulled out of the Gare du Nord. Was it wrong of her to experience a little fizz of excitement at the realization?
"I'm sorry we didn't find it,"
Sacha said earnestly. She waved him off with as few words.